How did composer Trevor Jones go about scoring the Dark Crystal soundtrack? That's what we'll be looking at today on the Dark Crystal Conjunction. Howdy y'all, and welcome to the Dark Crystal Conjunction. Last week we looked at the life and legacy of composer Trevor Jones. This week we are going to zoom in on one aspect of that legacy, his Dark Crystal soundtrack. We are going to do so by looking at an interview he did while in San Francisco on a research visit to Lucasfilm in July of 1985. This interview was conducted by Randall D. Larson and originally published in Cinema Score number 15, 1986/1987. The publication begins, quote, Trevor Jones emerged as a composer of note when he scored The Dark Crystal in 1982. While he had previously composed the music for Excalibur the year before, that music was overshadowed by excessive use of operatic chorales, and it wasn't until Jim Henson's elaborate puppet fantasy that Jones's music shone in its own symphonic splendor, end quote. I will link to the entire interview in the description, but now I'll skip down to the parts about the Dark Crystal, which take up about a fourth of the interview or so. A lot of the first section of the interview covers his life and influences, which we looked at in last week's video. It then gets into other films that he scored. We will begin, though, with him closing up his talk about scoring the psychological horror film The Sender, since the closing paragraph talks a little more about how he scores and why. Interviewer asked, quote, You basically approach the music then from a psychological point of view rather than just scoring the horror. The music was more subtle as far as getting beneath the surface, end quote. Jones then replies, quote, I try to. I mean, music is a direct emotional link to an audience. One has it in most public places, and one has it in the home. It becomes such an integral part of one's life that it works on a subliminal level in the main. People are aware of music and its emotional implications, and I feel that an audience is far too sophisticated to have bad scoring in a film. Apart from the fact that I feel I have my own standards which I need to adhere to and raise, I feel it's my job to reach an audience in the most subtle and effective and efficient way I can. One brings in all the techniques and all the ploys of the craft that one can muster to achieve those ends. I mean, an audience wants to be entertained, whether it's a horror picture, a pirate movie, a fantasy, or whatever the genre. You can be very sophisticated in all those mediums. How did you become involved with the Dark Crystal, and during what point in production did you start? I started the Dark Crystal very early. I don't think we even had a script yet. Jim Henson called me and asked if I'd like to be a part of this project. The Dark Crystal was a project in the real sense of the word. It was only a 90-minute film. It was music for fashion shows and exhibitions and the documentary of the making of the film, albums, and all sorts of things. I was in Moscow the other day, and I heard parts of it accompanying an icon exhibition. I find it fascinating to hear the music used in different contexts in different countries. On all the Henson projects, I tend to start incredibly early, and it's a wonder because I go about the world amassing information while I'm working on other projects. I can collate and collect information about a project I'm about to embark on, so I came to the Dark Crystal at a very early stage, before they'd even set up shooting. Similarly with Labyrinth, the new Henson film, we discussed Labyrinth when we were leaving America after the premiere of The Dark Crystal, so that was quite a while back. We're now shooting Labyrinth. That obviously benefits the work you're able to do because you have more time to become part of the film rather than an afterthought like often is the case. Absolutely. Some composers don't like working like that, but I do. I like being part of the filmmaking process, and I'm sure the subtleties that one brings to a score are ideas that you've worked through and digested and examined and knocked about and hammered home. My wastepaper basket is filled with things that people usually put on their pictures. That might sound awfully arrogant, but it's true. I tend to work through my ideas, even if the time is incredibly short. I know that a musical idea has a process which has to be worked through in order for it to actually start gelling with an image, and I'm not happy until I've achieved that fusion. How closely did you work with the filmmakers in establishing the kinds of music they wanted for Dark Crystal? Dark Crystal, initially, was going to be a score as innovative as the images. We were all set to examine using sound for its own sake, whether it was caused by acoustical instruments, electronics, building structures, whatever, and fusing a fantasy sound world. But when Gary Kurtz came to the project, it was decided that, because on this particular type of motion picture, which incorporated animatronics totally, there was not one live actor in it. The images would be so different that if one didn't write music which was associated with the conventional ideas that an audience would feel comfortably with, then you would lose the audience. I agreed entirely at that point, because as exciting as it would have been to do something like that, I felt that we were in danger of losing an audience completely if we didn't have a conventional sound that people could easily relate to. Hence the orchestral score. In doing that, I still tried to add tone colors and textures and things which complemented the fantasy world without it sounding too conventional. I wouldn't want to produce a score like anybody else's. I'm reminded of the scene where they're going down the river and you have these electronic sounds, which is really an impressive little piece. It both fit the scene and yet had a new texture. Well, that was the way we were going to work, but on a more extreme level, using sound for its own sake, and actually orchestrating and writing parts for all sorts of sounds that I captured on tape. But who knows, maybe we can work towards that in the future. How would you describe musically and orchestrally the score's thematic elements as they did evolve symphonically? The central core to my mind was the unity at the end of the film. The Urskex is the essential theme. The Urskex was a composite of the Mystics and the Skeksis, and they come together and fuse to form this fantastic creature, which is the perfect being. Throughout the film, I used two themes, and superimposed one on the other. The Mystics theme and the Skeksis theme, and at the end of the film, they come together and form the theme to the Dark Crystal. That's my little trademark, and I do tend to do that in all my projects. I have little subtleties which pertain to each particular project. There were also sorts of themes required. The Landstrider theme, Jen's theme, Kira's love theme, but they all stem from a central theme. The thematic ideas are all related. You can, in fact, analyze them in a symphonic way. You can take them apart and see that they derive from the same cluster of notes and work in an organized intellectual fashion. But all that is totally irrelevant if it does not have an effect on the audience. If it doesn't move the audience, then there is no point in scoring. Would you describe the type of electronic sounds desired for the Dark Crystal, and how they were created and put to use? For instance, in the opening power ceremony, there's a sort of electronic chainsaw and things like that, which hurtle across the sound spectrum. All those sounds were initially there to offset the orchestral sounds, to make the whole power ceremony as strange as possible, and to, in fact, hook the audience. I don't know how far we succeeded in doing that, so I found it incredibly exciting producing all these sounds. We spent a good few weeks actually just coming up with sounds, which were all cataloged on floppy disk, and I would think that would be a good sound for the Mystic, or that would be a good sound for the Skeksis, or this situation or that situation, and when I came to scoring it, I found that maybe it worked better in this scene or better in that scene. It's wonderful ending up with a palette of sounds and having many colors to draw on. I enjoy doing that very much. But I find it equally challenging to work in a smaller dimension. I did a piece for the BBC, the last of the James Manson film, Dr. Fisher of Geneva, in which I used a very small lineup of about 3 players. I notice in America, one is either a film composer or a television composer. And although my life is film, I love the big image, the big screen, the big sound. I'm not adverse to scoring for television. Some of the finest mini projects I've worked on, The Last Place on Earth, for instance, Dr. Fisher of Geneva, and recently a documentary film about Karen Blixen, the Danish writer whose story is told in Out of Africa. The BBC asked me to score the documentary of her life, which I found absolutely riveting, because I could then bring into play the African music I had studied, especially the music of the Kikuyu and all the tribes around her house in Kenya. If the subject matter interests me, if the film is well made, and if I feel I can bring something more to it in the music, then I will score the film. If I feel that I can't bring anything else to the movie, then I won't do it, which I have done for the BBC in the past. I went to one screening and I said, "I'm sorry, but I think the film's absolutely fine as it is. If you use just sound effects on the opening titles and sound effects on the end credits, the film would work without any music at all." The result was that I went home not having got the job, and I realized on the train that I talked myself out of work. But there's a small coda to the story, in that the film went on to win a prize. But I enjoy scoring films which have been well made. I put in as much energy into films which have been well made as I do into films which have been badly made, so I'd far sooner do the ones that have been well made. One final question on Dark Crystal. I like the Pod Village music. What traditions did you draw upon for this festive material, and did it entail any kind of research? Not really, because the Pod people don't derive from any continent that we know. Basically, Jim had said to me, "I want party music." I didn't know what the Pod people were about, because this music was being recorded before the shooting, so I was faced with no images and no idea what the film's going to look like. I went away and I produced a tape, but unfortunately I produced a demo tape, which was just me going into a little studio with 2 players. We just tracked and had a great time. So I played the cassette for Jim and asked, "Is this along the right lines?" He said, "That is it, I love it," and I was stuck with this piece, which was a demo, which we then had to use for the film, and on a technical level, there were several things to be desired. But Jim knows exactly when an idea is right. He will jump on it and say, "Don't change a note." If it's not right, he will tell you equally, and he will give you explicit indication as to which direction to move in. So I find it incredibly enjoyable working with him, because his method of filmmaking is unlike anybody else's I know. We learned an enormous amount on Dark Crystal. We're shooting Labyrinth with David Bowie. We now have actors, and we have a script which we feel very happy about. It's a very exciting piece, and one that I'm terrifically excited about. End quote. That concludes the interview. There is still much more to say about the music of the Dark Crystal, but we'll have to save that for another episode. I'll probably move into doing some more lore videos for a while, as I do want to get caught up on those. There's a lot of lore and history of Thra that we have yet to go through. But anyways, thanks for joining me today, and until next time, keep exploring Thra.